I'm Sheree Coulter, and welcome to the Life and Liberty podcast. Today, we have the honor of having my friend Rod Martin here join us on the podcast. Rod is the founder and CEO of Martin Capital, and he also writes at rodmartin.org, where he delivers excellent geopolitical analysis daily. He is also a tech entrepreneur and investor and was part of the team that started PayPal. So thank you so much, Rod, for joining us today on the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So, Rod, a lot of people have been watching the recent events in the news, especially with the election of Mamdani in New York City. And they're needing to be brought up to speed a little bit, they think, on what is this that people have just decided to elect in New York City. So I wanted to see if you could come on today to the podcast to just give us kind of the lay of the land of, what's going on here with the election. People obviously in mass decided to vote for a socialist candidate. So what can we understand from that? What can we expect to see happen in America with that kind of embrace of socialism coming into the states? And then also, what can Christians do to combat that? And so we can kind of break that down into different bite sizes, but for people to kind of have a roadmap of where we're going with this, I'd love to just toss it out to you, Rod, and see if you can first just bring us up to speed on what is going on.
Well, I think the first and most important thing to understand is that in the Christian era, virtually anything that arises in the West or near the West is some form of Christian heresy, because Satan is around all the time and he has the same agenda from the garden to the final judgment. And Christ, of course, is king. He alone is sovereign over all things. So everything is a counterfeit. Everything is a rebellion. Nothing is, some kind of equal and opposite thing to God in some dualistic fashion, yin and yang. None of that is real. That is itself heresy. What we see are reactions to the existing Christian civilization that has been dominant in the West now for about 1,700 years. So it shouldn't shock us when we see, as we do with socialism, an entire worldview that is 180 degrees from Christianity while still playing on all of Christianity's virtues. It's a scam. It's aimed at weaponizing your empathy, weaponizing your virtue against you and against the Lord for the purpose of transferring power to a very small elite. So, what has that turned into? Well, throughout the world, we have seen socialists by whatever they call themselves. Sometimes they call themselves fascists. Sometimes they call themselves Nazis. Sometimes they call themselves communists. Everywhere and always, socialism is socialism. And every one of those forms that I just described would tell you that their end goal is the establishment of socialism. So what is socialism? Well, socialism is the systematic violation of the 10th commandment, that thou shalt not covet. Or to put that another way, you shouldn't steal. You shouldn't even think about stealing. And so it's the systematic violation of that. And then it works back up the Decalogue until it deifies the state. And that makes perfect sense from a certain point of view. If you are not a believer, it makes sense that the state would be in a position to dole out blessings and curses. And we see this manifest in classical Marxism with the idea of class warfare. The bourgeoisie, which is the people who own the means of production, and the proletariat, the poor working man who's being oppressed. But we see it in modern times in critical theory, in its various applications: critical race theory, queer theory, radical feminism, LGBTQ agenda. We see trans theory, we see queer theory. All of these things are aimed at creating smaller and smaller oppressed groups. The whole proletariat thing didn't really sell that well in the West because everybody in the West figures their kids are going to be better off than they are, and they think that's a good idea. So since class warfare didn't sell that much, they repackaged it as an oppressor versus oppressed, which is no different, just different labels. And we have defined certain people, primarily white Christian men, as being irredeemable. Hillary actually used that word, irredeemable, incapable of redemption, versus other groups who simply because they are defined to have a certain status, who are incapable of sin. So when you hear various black leaders talking about how black people are incapable of racism, they literally mean it. And likewise, they get to define who's who. So Herman Cain wasn't black. Ben Carson isn't black. Carol Swain isn't black because, as Joe Biden told you, if you're not for me, you ain't black. Well, he wasn't just riffing. He was dead serious, because all of these categories are based on how you identify. You identify based on ideology, not on actual skin color or gender or whatever. If you decide, well, if I decide today that I'm a woman and you decide that you're a man, that's perfectly acceptable. Probably would be suspect because we're the wrong color, but we would be accepted if we seemed vaguely sincere. And that's absurd. That's absolutely stupid. Biology is immutable. I'm a man, you're a woman. And the same thing is true across the range of categories within this critical theory mishmash they call intersectionality. And the aim is very simple. It's all super complex, so you get lost in the dumb details. But the aim is very simple. If you get enough people aggrieved at one another, eventually they overthrow the existing system and they put the only people they all collectively trust in power, and those people, no longer encumbered by the U.S. Constitution or any meaningful restraints thereof, get to do whatever the heck they want. So in the name of charity, in the name of caring for our neighbor, in the name of opposing oppression, in the name of all these Christian virtues, we actually establish a tyranny and we ultimately deify the state. It's the same playbook from 1848 to probably 2548. If the Lord doesn't return before then, it never changes. Only the labels change.
Yeah, it's crazy because it really seems, as you're explaining, that, this is a replacement of what we all have with Christianity, where, God tells us to be charitable of our own free will. And here you have, the state wanting to step in and become that and become the arbiter of how do we dole out charity. And it all sounds so good. Honestly, it's nothing new. It's just been happening since the garden, of making something that's not right look right by making it, clothing it in something that sounds good and is appealing and sounds so loving and compassionate. But can you talk us through just a little bit of how this is really a bait and switch, because it's not so compassionate at all?
Oh, it absolutely is. Because if you arrogate to yourself the right to define people based on characteristics that you attribute to them, part of what's inherent in that is the dehumanization of anybody who is defined as a class enemy or an oppressor. So, we see that in all the different varieties of socialism. We see it in democratic socialist countries like Britain after World War II, where before Margaret Thatcher came into power, 2/3 of Britain had been reduced to such poverty that they had to live in government housing. And you had expropriated the hard-earned wealth of a lot of people to be able to get there. Well, that's relatively soft, smiley face socialism. It upended everything and it ruined a lot of lives, but didn't kill a lot of people. In Hitler's Germany, they defined the Jews as the oppressors. So, however improbably that might be. And so they proceeded to kill 6 million Jews and 4 million other people they found undesirable in some way. In Russia, in the name of democratizing the means of production, in the name of fairness, in the name of relieving the oppressed, the Soviets murdered about 20 million of their own people, so double Hitler. And then Mao did the same thing in China, but he hit 65 million dead in a relatively short time. And Pol Pot topped everybody on a proportionate basis. He killed 1/3 of all of Cambodia in the span of about 2.5 years, it was so much an atrocity that a neighboring communist country invaded to stop it. So, this is true everywhere. They always promise that we're going to end poverty, that we're going to lift people up, that we're going to give everyone their fair share. And what they end up doing at best is reducing everyone to a shared poverty, except themselves. They are always wealthy. The Politburo in the Soviet Union had its dachas on the Black Sea coast. They all live as well as a duke or an earl, while you work 14-hour days in their slave factories. And that is always the case. And that would be the case here if Mamdani had the ability to implement all of his plan. That would be New York. But he lacks it because he's got a city council and a state government that are going to hold him back to some degree. And at the same time, a lot of the people who are going to pay for this are going to move to Florida and Texas.
Right. And I continue to see people posting online, Texas is full, Florida is full. Of course, that is, just rhetorical. But
we're not.
yeah.
Actually, we benefited tremendously from the lockdowns because all of these big fund managers moved to Palm Beach or to Miami. We even got a lot of really top tier Silicon Valley talent. Texas is just busting at the seams, and you guys are winning by bigger election margins than you were a few years ago, as are we. So it's not all just, Democrats coming to turn us blue. That's not how that's working. And Dallas is about to get this new Texas Stock Exchange, which I would predict strongly, and I have, is going to draw a lot of listings away from the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. Who wants to have a legal nexus with all that craziness? It's just insane. Just like you don't want to have a legal nexus with Delaware anymore. So people are reincorporating their businesses in Texas and in Florida, and they ought to. It's necessary. So one of the things socialism always does is it impoverishes its own people. And what they long for is enough power to build a Berlin Wall around themselves so that their own people can't escape. That's very different from the wall on the southern border that is preventing millions upon millions of people from coming in. And it tells you everything you need to know about socialism, that many of the people coming are coming from socialist countries. We don't see any migrant caravans going to any socialist countries, and we never have in 100 years. So this is what we're contending with, and New York's going to have a really tough time.
So for people who are in Florida or in Texas or in a state like that, where they're, feeling pretty confident that they're not about to elect someone like Mamdani, but they're looking across the way and saying, wow, that's going to be a train wreck. What do Christians do who want to say, I want to preclude that from becoming what I see in my state? How can Christians be active in saying, we are not going down that road?
Well, we have to actually tie the principles of our faith to our practice, and not just in church. It's all fine and good to say that we're going to teach Sunday school a little bit better. Yeah, but the world's happening outside the church door, and we should equip the saints every Sunday. I would hope we do it Sunday night and Wednesday night too. I think that's all great. I grew up with that. But then you live your life. We were called to be stewards of God's world in every possible respect. And it doesn't matter if the rapture is next Tuesday or next millennium. Jesus has told us that we are to be found faithful in our task at the moment that he returns. So I have to plan for the next 1,000 years, even if he shows up in the next 1,000 seconds. It doesn't really change my task. So I look at a school board, and we've had tremendous success with school boards in recent years, thanks to groups like Moms for Liberty. We even flipped the school board in Miami, of all crazy places, and we've got the city council and the mayor too. And that makes a huge difference for kids because, look, I don't care how much parents think they can influence. their children and counter program what the education system is doing. You hand your kids to the education system for 12 or 14 years before college, and they have them all day, and then they send them home with homework, and somehow you're supposed to know everything they're being taught and counter it. And how are they supposed to trust their teachers and get a decent grade if you're telling them that their teacher is full of it? That doesn't make sense. So one of the things Christians have to do is get more serious about Christian education, whether in private schools or homeschooling. Makes no difference. Different people have different needs. We understand that. But more Christians need to be more intentional about raising the next generation. Bible is full of admonitions on this very thing. And likewise, we have to actually get involved in politics. There's just no escaping it. We face an enemy that is using politics to establish a false religion that defines every area of our life. I didn't get to choose to fight in the Pacific during World War II. Japan chose that for me. Likewise, these evil people have chosen this battlefield for us. We have to go there. We have to win. And when we're done, we create a limited government that is God-honoring and that produces freedom and prosperity and opportunity for the least of these.
Wow, I could not even put that better. So to sum up, to get involved, Christians need to be getting, their churches speaking out on these things, hopefully sermons that are talking about these kinds of things, real life issues, and what is the biblical worldview position to understand this. And second, Christian education, so important with our next generation, should not be overlooked. In fact, I think it's really incredible that the left has used that as a major tool in really raising up people to their, way of thinking. And so, we have got to get on board. And third, like you said, getting involved in politics, it's not a thing that Christians, have the luxury of staying out of. We need to be involved in the self-governing of our nation. So I hope that people will take these to heart, Rod. Excellent insight and really needed for this time. So thank you so much for joining us on the Life and Liberty podcast today.
Thank you.
This has been an edition of the Life and Liberty podcast of the Danbury Institute. The Danbury Institute is an association of churches, Christians, and organizations aligned to affirm and preserve God-given rights to life and liberty. To learn more, visit danburyinstitute.org. The work of the Danbury Institute relies on generous patriots like you. To support, visit danburyinstitute.org/give.